Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started with the webinar in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Megan McDonald. I'm the Director of Marketing at 451 Research. Today's webinar, Paging Doctor IoT, IoT Meets Healthcare, will be presented by John Spooner, Senior Analyst for Internet of Things, and Rosanna Jimenez, Research Associate for Internet of Things. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give a brief introduction to 451 for those of you who aren't familiar with us. 451 Research is a top-tier IT research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our team of more than 100 analysts publish over 4,500 reports and cover more than 2,000 technology vendors and service providers in their research each year. Our core focus on technology innovation and market disruption enables our customers to stay ahead of the digital transformation curve. Before I turn it over to today's presenters, just a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar slides can be downloaded in the Attachments and Links section of the BrightTalk platform. You can submit questions to the presenters through the same platform, and the webinar recording will be available immediately after today's session. And now I will turn it over to John Spooner.
Thank you, Megan. Today we're here to talk about the merger of IoT and healthcare within the IoT space. Before we do that, we'll give a little bit of housekeeping and talk a little bit about what is Internet of Things at 451. From our perspective, we cover both the market and the technology and the business and provide those insights combined with the needs of the customers and their sort of levels of adoption, market sizing, and M&A. So we cover the complete spectrum of IoT within the practice. And today, you'll hear much more about how we go into the vertical markets within IoT and provide coverage in those spaces. So today we'll talk about 4 major topics. We'll do a level set. We'll talk about the main trends that we see coming in the near future within the space, challenges and opportunities for our clients, largely the vendors, and then a little bit about what's next. And before we get into all of this, let's talk about the main theme. It's really about using IoT technology to enable the goals and the needs of the overarching community, which in this case is patient, and it's all centered around the patient, but includes the providers, the payers, and the technology vendors themselves. It's one giant continuum, but within that, there's really a journey that each kind of constituent undertakes. And at the end of the day, it's about keeping people out of the hospital, it's about improving the patient experience, and it's about lowering costs for everyone involved. To do this really requires setting up the patient and the provider for success and essentially helping the provider do their job with access to new data on a continuous basis with tools that help them make better meaning of it and address far more quickly many of the symptoms and essentially keep people from getting sicker by being far more proactive. And that dovetails with the major themes in the healthcare industry at this point in time, which are very much about moving from a reactive and sort of in-house or inpatient sort of delivery model to an outpatient, remotely monitored, much more proactive delivery model, if you will, a standard of care. And that's for not just critical and chronically ill patients, but for patients who are sort of at risk of becoming chronically ill, and even the relatively healthy populations that are out there now. And it's really about keeping them there. So everything that's done is really about keeping people out of the hospital. And that's just patients. Patients are both consumers and businesses. Payers are insurance companies, governments, businesses as well, commercial enterprises who deliver healthcare to their employees, consumers who purchase as a service, which will be an increasing trend. Providers, they're the teaching hospitals, the community hospitals, the skilled nursing facilities, the outpatient and urgent care clinics, and even retailers, where companies like CVS have what they call minute clinics, where people can go in and get a certain level of care. And finally, technology, who are the technology space, who are the providers of equipment and devices, the electronic health record that is really at the center of all of this. Software, whether that's packaged or as a service, actual services, CNSI, and then infrastructure, including cloud hosting. So when we get into the level set, when we talk about where the market is at this point in time, and we go into some of the data that we have available, what we call the voice of the enterprise, look at where the healthcare market is compared to the sort of market at large for IoT. The buyers, in this case, largely the provider community, are really still focused on using technology to save cost, using IoT to save cost and reduce risk. That's great. That's not unlike where most of the customers that we talk to today are situated. And it's sort of in line with overall IoT adoption, but it does mean that it's a very reactive view on the marketplace. They're doing things that are largely aimed at controlling the current environment and not necessarily thinking about the next step, which is the proactive sort of delivery, the new offerings, the outpatient use cases that we have mentioned and that we will go into more detail today. So where there's great interest, there's not necessarily as great a level of progress. And that's one important trend to keep in mind as we go through this discussion today. This data, by the way, is based on a survey of about 750 IT buyers that took place at the end of last year and early this year, and the actual healthcare sample is about 50 individuals. So it's a little bit of a subset of those folks. So I apologize, I went too far there. One more very important trend to keep in mind is despite the tremendous cost savings that IoT can bring, ROI is the most imminent problem that's really faced by that whole community that we described earlier. So even though they believe that IoT can help, and for the most part, as you see on the bottom of the slide here, they're actually going ahead and doing it where they feel it's the right thing to do. They have a very hard time measuring it, and they have an even harder time showing it as positive. Sometimes some people say you get what you inspect, and in this case it's very difficult to really understand that the dollars that are going into IoT are actually producing a result, which when you take a giant step back, shows a lot of skepticism and is really a holdback for the provider community. As everybody knows, I think in the discussions that we've had, that saving costs and reducing the number of people that go into the hospital is a significant return on investment. So the real disconnect here is the association of IoT with helping patients get better faster, stay out of the hospital, and don't come back, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about what some of those challenges are and maybe some of the use cases and applications that move to sort of overcome that problem. But ROI is a significant barrier to further adoption. As we level set today, please keep that in mind. So as we go ahead, now that we've sort of set the level, let's talk about what all this means in the near term. And here are 6 trends that we think are very important to watch over the next 18 months to say 24 months. and they are the data deluge. And that's coming. Insane amounts of data will begin to sort of come forth from all these IoT applications. The vendor landscape will become exceedingly complex, and there will be many, many, many new use cases. And those use cases will then, of course, drive even more applications. The applications, many of them focused on force multiplication for clinicians and helping them serve more people in a less amount of time, do more and be more proactive. An EHR reboot is coming, and there will be far more empowered patients. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to have access to this data and then more, and also provide the clinicians with feedback on their level of care. So the first trend, the data deluge, this is on its way. And the reason we say that is because although there's a great deal of collection of data from medical devices, among the constituents we're talking about here, the providers in this case, we're not doing nearly as much in collecting data from end devices, and they're not doing as much in collecting data on their own physical plants. So if there are 3 use cases within IoT for the healthcare space that involve or revolve around data, collecting data from medical devices, collecting it from your patients via the smartphone or other connected devices, and connecting data about your actual operations, there's really only a lot of activity in one space, which is in-house collection of data from pumps and medical equipment. They're not out there really gaining data or grabbing data from the remote monitored patient for the use of better diagnostics. So once all these go to 100, and they'll get close, the data deluge begins, and it's a significant amount of data and information that must be managed. Moving ahead, the next trend, the value chain, is complexifying. When you start to lay the IoT value chain on top of the existing healthcare IT construct, where there are devices and systems of record, and then there are largely on-premise and some hosted applications, you have a really sort of diverse layer a diverse number of technologies all interacting, both devices and gateways, the networks that connect them, the applications that essentially take all that data and begin to make meaning of it, and then the systems of record, which in this case are the IoT systems, which must be merged with systems of control, which tend to be the EHR, and also the hospital CRM system, the scheduling and those functions. Then, after you're done with all that, you have to lay it across both an inpatient sort of fixed purview, and then the outpatient, which is something somewhat fixed but also mobile, fixed in the home, mobile everywhere else, in delivering these remote monitoring use cases and applications that we'll talk a little bit more about. It becomes an exceptionally complex picture to manage. So it will create a number of new battlegrounds, it'll create a number of new challenges, but it will ultimately deliver on some of the promises of remote managed care, remote patient interaction. Next, we have a number of new use cases, and this is sort of like IoT 101 in a lot of cases. Some of them are new old use cases which are made more applicable by the capabilities of IoT. So many of these reboots can now be accomplished with the benefits that IoT brings, which tend to be increasing the precision and then reducing the latency of a specific application. So telemedicine isn't necessarily IoT, but it's made better by IoT. And emergency response, made better by IoT, and many of the sort of guided health management use cases are the same. Moving ahead into specific applications. So with all these new use cases come many, many new new applications. There are tens and tens of applications for every use case. So what happens is they all break down into sort of varieties of increasingly urgent, preventative, remote sort of management applications from the very end to the very beginning. I'm sorry, from the very high latency, low precision application, the sleep management, the weight management type of application, all the way up to I've fallen and I need an ambulance type application. These are all supported by IoT. And in the middle, the post-acute care management is something that is of particular interest, I think, to both the providers and payers, and chronic condition care as well. And those are where remote monitoring, remote management of patients and their symptoms are getting a significant amount of attention from the vendors and our clients, from the payers, and from the legislator as well, from both the federal and local level at in the United States, and of course not just in the United States but elsewhere in addition to. So ultimately, AI will play a significant role in all of these, and it will help deliver that high precision, low latency information. And ultimately what it does is help the clinician understand the individual and then the population and get a baseline view into what a person should look like when they're reasonably healthy, or at least when they get out of the hospital, compared to how they are today, and also compared to how they are against the population. And with that information in mind, the clinician can then organize themselves and organize their day in such a way that they're treating the people that need the most urgent care. And that could be as simple as picking up the phone and calling someone and saying, I need to see you right now. Or it could be as urgent as through various different types of technologies, you determine that someone is having a heart attack or has fallen and needs immediate assistance. And in some constructs, you could summon emergency care. So these use cases are extremely diverse, but all go back to that original theme that we talked about, which is keeping people healthy by keeping them largely out of the hospital, either on a return trip in the case of the post-acute care individuals, or in treating people with conditions like COPD and trying to intervene earlier when they start to go in a direction where they look like they might have to go into the hospital. So it's all about preventative and being more proactive. And again, it goes back into the large themes that we see in the healthcare space at this point in time, which are to become more proactive in order to help save on costs and also deliver to a broader audiences, if at all possible. So what does this mean for technology? I'm sure that all of our clients who are listening to this are interested in how that might unfold. And one of the main things that we see, and in going to the HIMSS show and in talking to all the people that we have spoken with in these last few months, the EHR becomes the main point of conversation at some point in every talk that we have. And the difficulty is that this is the system of record, right? This is where all this patient information that we've been sort of talking about, this is where it sort of lives. The problem is that it's very static, and it becomes sort of a bucket of numbers, and that's why we use the funnel analogy. And going forward, given the nature of IoT and really the nature of technology adoption and the disruptive nature of cloud and all the other tools that are at people's disposal, it's ultimately going to become much more of a dynamic sort of cycle, which supports the acquisition, the collection, and sort of standardization, ultimately storage and archiving, but the generation of insights and outputting and dashboarding of all this information. A clinician really can't make a decision that helps save somebody from going into a hospital anyway without having a really solid view into the the health of not only their individual patients, but their patients at large. So the output and dashboard piece is really important. And this doesn't mean that this is a clean cut, a clean break over to the new regime or anything like that. I'm not saying EHRs are going away. I'm saying that they will become more dynamic over time, and there are already moves afoot to sort of drive this process. And there are several examples, which one or two of which we'll cite today. Ultimately, the EHR to remain the system of record will become more dynamic. There'll be efforts where vendors build around it in the interim, and then in the long term, maybe they're over the next 5 to 10 years, it will change and look more like a cloud application going forward. But it has to be supportive of the predictive nature of the healthcare IoT technology as it exists today, and then as it moves forward, to really aid this refocus on preventative and predictive sort of medical practices going forward. So that's another trend that we see. And finally, and Rosanna will speak to this, the increasingly empowered patient, which the immediacy of technology will create.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the trend of the empowered patient is on the rise. Today, we are able to rate many of our experiences almost as soon as they happen via our cell phones. So why not healthcare? There are open source websites today where you can rate your physicians, but that requires you to look up the website, find the particular physician, and even then, we can never really be sure that doctors or hospital administrators will ever look at them. But by providing patients with the ability to provide that near real-time private feedback in an easy-to-use mobile app, not only will patients feel empowered, but that data that they provide can be extremely beneficial to doctors and hospitals for pinpointing weaknesses and strengths. And this is something that we believe will be used as a KPI.
Okay, and we've already seen examples of this. So to wrap up on the 6 trends, all this means a tremendous amount of change. And with that comes opportunity. There will be some major battlegrounds going forward, we think, and we'll talk about those next. There will be 3 big battlegrounds in this space. The first one may be the most obvious one, but it will be around devices and gateways. As medical devices become much more advanced and have the ability to gather more data, the number of devices involved and then the amount of data that they collect will begin to explode. And we've already seen this begin with the fact that individuals are now walking around with heart rate monitors on their wrists. And maybe they didn't buy an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a device like that because they wanted continuous access to their heart rate. Most people don't care about that until they have a problem. However, with the advancement of technology, those capabilities come, and they are useful. So we see that happening in addition to medical devices becoming smarter, healthcare OT equipment becoming smarter. And the example, one example there is GE making X-ray machines with enough intelligence in them to help prioritize the way images are read once they transfer off that machine into the system and an actual technician starts to look at them. It can help prioritize that technician's workload for a day. And again, it goes back to helping them to be a little bit more proactive and really focus on the task at hand. In addition to that, I call it pharma management. Well, what does that mean? That means medication management, both from a tracking sort of back-end side, but also from the patient side, and helping people to understand when to take their pills and what happens if they don't, and then get them to follow their regimes is also an important area, and that's kind of a device battleground as well. There are a number of companies that we've seen that have begun to work in this area. Next battleground, infrastructure and equipment. This is probably our favorite one because we get to talk about cloud. But where we have the advent of this new regime, and we talked about the cycle on the right-hand side here, which is sort of will be the new application of electronic health records. It begets cloud. Cloud has certain capabilities that allow it to ingest, analyze, and then output insights. At least the cloud regime allows for that. So we see a infrastructure battleground in which the existing players will provide sort of a hybrid opportunity or a hybrid capability where Amazon and Google and Azure from Microsoft and others will come in and say, y'all got to get on the cloud. We heard that at HIMSS with Eric Schmidt essentially saying cloud is the way to do all of this. And finally, the way that applications are being utilized even today, where they interface with the EHR, they tend to be cloud-hosted applications which transfer data into the EHR. It becomes a massive battleground, both in the basic "do I move to cloud or not" question, and that will be answered on a kind of a case-by-case basis. But the general gravity will be towards cloud, or at least towards a hybrid model. And then there will be individual opportunities to move applications and ultimately EHR implementations to cloud. And that's begun, but it will become a much more pervasive trend and therefore a battleground. And finally, something we like to call the system of systems. Specifically, systems that aggregate and control these very large data sets. So the true system of systems would overlay an EHR function, CRM function, and then control this application layer, which tends to be the go-between and tends to focus on a specific point problem. We've seen some examples of this already. In some areas, GE Digital actually, for one, is doing a kind of a greenfield installation. When in Saudi Arabia, where they're actually building an EHR that lives sort of within Predix, which is their IoT platform. That's very interesting. That won't happen very quickly or very often, given the massive investments in EHRs to this point or at this point in time. However, the controlling function of all this data will become a battleground. And finally, or just about finally, where would we be without an ecosystem, right? Who are the ecosystem players? Where do they come from, and how do they interact? There are four kind of basic buckets that we look at. Many more actual players, but these are just a handful of vendors that we've spoken to, that we've seen in the marketplace that have done or entered into partnerships with other vendors and done interesting things. And some of them are focused on the patient, such as?
So in the patient-specific sphere, we have here Apple and Samsung, and Physic and Validic as well for some examples. Apple and Samsung are providing connectivity to apps and wellness sensors and devices, which many of us have seen or use ourselves today. Physic, they use connected sensors and machine learning based analytics to learn patient baselines in order to spot small changes in their health status. And what this does is signify any impending health decline, which in turn saves clinicians time in deciphering patient activity, and it can be scaled up to accommodate large medical trials and treatment plans. Validic, what they do is they take on the burden of extracting, analyzing, and managing device-generated data for healthcare providers. And that allows them to focus on providing care to their patients and not spend their energy trying to sift through complex patient data.
One of the individuals that we spoke with said that Validic was allowing them to democratize their devices, which is a major important trend as they essentially use that vendor to get out of the business of managing IT, or managing the devices that they use to deliver remote patient monitoring. In addition to the sort of patient-oriented technologies, there are a number of providers who are doing interesting things. Among them, and these are just examples, there are many, many more that are out there in the marketplace. Kaiser, Partners, and Mercy, all in the U.S., are all investing in remote monitoring, both directly in terms of doing trials and testing the equipment, but more the application of it, the use case. And also they're investing. They're investing money in these partners. Validic, for example, and Kaiser have a relationship in which Kaiser invested in Validic, and I think as part of their provided funds as part of their B round of financing. So not only are they testing out the equipment and proving the application and showing that it works, they're actually putting their own funds into the development of this ecosystem as well. Inside the payer space, many, many different and diverse types of activities, but some of the most important ones, or most interesting ones anyway, are things like the United Healthcare Motion program, which they launched with Qualcomm Life. And that program essentially uses dollars to motivate people and does so by measuring their activity, the frequency, the intensity, and I love this, they call it the tenacity of the individual, providing rewards to those who hit the marks. And in order to be tenacious, you have to have 10,000 steps a day. So that's not a small number. So they're rewarding people who are doing and taking steps to make themselves a little bit healthier. And finally, there's CVS Caremark, which is invested in minute clinics, which you can sign up for online and go and get some basic level of treatment. And they've done some really interesting and helpful things, like provide mobile applications that let you refill your prescriptions and make it easier to get some of the services you need. So when we talk about the empowered patient, they're certainly supporting that. And finally, Amazon and Walmart, what are they doing in the payer category? You might ask me, and the reason we call them out is, although it's still sort of unclear exactly what they're doing, it looks like they're going in a couple of different directions. Obviously, Amazon wants to be part of healthcare as a cloud provider, has an opportunity to be part of the digital home as the maker of Alexa, which everybody, well, not everybody, but many people have in their homes and are used to interacting with. But finally, with the sort of early information about the work it's done with Berkshire, is the idea that potentially Amazon does one of two things. It gets into the business, which is what everybody's really afraid of. I also want to mention that in addition to all that, Amazon might actually be, or Walmart might actually be, entering into an era where they develop their own kind of network and have their own doctors and not hospitals, but their own network of providers who they have control over, and from a cost management perspective, try to have their own healthcare, their own insurance network, if you will. So we'll see what happens, but we want to highlight those two as potential examples of businesses, commercial enterprises, who are looking to wade into the marketplace, and given their number of employees they have and their resources, can actually afford to do it. And finally, I call the AWS, Google, Microsoft, Epic and Cerner, and Apple and Samsung, and they're all significantly important given their positions in the marketplace. AWS, Google, and Microsoft Azure are all HIPAA certified now, and they have the ability to securely store patient data, and so they're focusing on applying cloud to healthcare, and they're also working around, particularly in the case of AWS, working around the edges, and they have partnerships with many of the startup companies that we have either mentioned or have covered in our service. They provide, or Amazon provides literally the cloud capability for just about all of these applications. Epic and Cerner will be involved in delivering the next generation EHR, if you will. And Apple and Samsung, they're not just the platform for collecting data, but they're also the platform for delivering data as well. And the most recent Apple iOS update, there are about 40 different providers who allow you to now connect your iPhone to their back-end system. So if you're a United Healthcare customer, or if you're a partner's patient, you can literally get your records right on your phone, and that does help democratize access to patient information. People more control over their own, at least a feeling of control over their own information, and will be a significant sort of trend going forward.
So, with the commingling of IoT and healthcare, we see that that technology will help hospitals to do more with less, upgrade a better patient experience, and ultimately could lower costs and save lives. But before that happens, there will be some challenges. So let's quickly just wrap up with what we think will come next.
So we see 4 trends, and four topics of ongoing discussion, really. Transformation. So doctors, hospitals, and patients can probably agree on one thing. It's that they don't want to manage technology. So although they will use technology to alter their processes, they'll do it in such a way that it becomes transparent and the technology becomes part of the delivery of healthcare as opposed to a separate, must be managed type of beast like it is today. So they'll transform their practices using technology in some respects to get the technology out of the way. Skills. Someone's got to do all this work, right, to deliver these capabilities. Healthcare informatics is a field that will rise to the level of today's data scientists. Data scientists and IoT are the rock stars, right? They're the ones who are the make meaning of all this data. So the healthcare informatics expert will become the purveyor of all these new workflows for clinicians and this new level of service to patients. Data stewardship, this is the way to think about it, okay? Because patients ultimately own their data, and there's some debate about that, but ultimately I think the agreement will be that the patient owns the data. We all, as participants in the ecosystem, become the stewards. They might grant access to it. They might provide it to a provider or a payer or even a technology vendors. But like a bank who protects your money, holds on to it, and keeps it safe, they also have certain responsibilities. So data stewardship will be the new term. And finally, the last thing to keep in mind is that the outcomes, not the technology, are really what matter. So I don't know how many times in IoT in the last 3 years that we've had this discussion with individual clients. Ultimately, the outcome, which is again keeping the patient potentially safe out of the hospital and reducing the burden on that individual and then the burden on the provider and the payer, is what matters. So that's the outcome that really matters the most. And with that, we'll take some questions.
Thank you, John and Rosanna. Just a reminder, everyone, you can submit questions through the Bright Talk user panel where it says questions from audience. So a couple of questions have come in, John. First one, what are alternatives for IoT in healthcare when cloud is not an option?
Yes, I knew that question was going to come, and I appreciate that question because I didn't exactly explain it when I talked about it. So it's really there are a number of different delivery models, right? There's and there's a lot of, I won't throw edge into here or blockchain, but we'll just, wait, I did. Let's just talk about the physical kind of infrastructure. So clearly there's an ability to have a completely on-premise solution. So you could have a captive data center and a captive network that captured all that data in a campus, and it would be certainly easier to do it that way with mainly inpatient individuals. The difficulty is when you have people who are at home and you have to send their data over a network. So the alternative for cloud is essentially on-premise, and we don't think that everything in every single application is going to go to cloud in every instance everywhere. I think everybody's smart enough to know that won't happen, but it'll certainly become an option, and it will be exercised in a far greater level going forward. Megan, you want me to just take the next question? I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, sure. So the question is, who is making decisions about healthcare in hospitals? Do doctors have input, administrators, and what does the table look like? Who's sitting at it, and who really has the budget and power to fund IoT deployments within healthcare?
Right. That's an interesting question, because it's not unlike any other industry. For the most part, there are different vendors who sell to different constituents. There are certainly IT vendors that sell to IT that know that, but at the end of the day, it's a kind of a cross-practice view. We've seen in a lot of the instances of the partners and the Kaisers, there are sort of hospital level executives who rise into a position to be sort of like the director of remote monitoring, remote patient care. So for the most part, point applications will still be sold to the hospital administrators. IT will be involved, and it'll be a big mess, like it is now with IoT. But the table will ultimately have to look like somebody from the clinician side, somebody from the administrative side, and somebody from IT. They're all going to have to get together and decide on how to allocate their dollars. And I'll tell you that the IT folks, and in healthcare it's a little bit different because they all tend to have some clinical background. They're all pretty skeptical, and they've been here before, and they've been told that this technology, whatever it was going to be something that made their lives so much easier and all that stuff. And in many cases it did, but in many cases it also brought with it a new set of problems. Any clinicians, they love to complain about EHRs, and how difficult they are to use. So it's got to have to be a cross-practice view. That, of course, will slow everything down and make it more difficult, but I don't see it really being successful any other way. I see plenty of point product sales. I see many sort of payer-influenced projects as well, and I see a lot of cross-partnership and cross-pollination between the providers and many of these startups that are out there. So it's a little bit more collaborative, and I believe, this is my personal opinion, I believe it will have to be. So we had a couple of more questions, Megan?
Yep, we have time to take one more. So how long will it take IoT to become truly prevalent in the remote monitoring space and use case?
That's another great one. So that you're talking about a period of years here, for sure. There are a number of early use cases, there are a number of clinical trials that have been done and are ongoing right now. So in the last 12 to 18 months, there have been a number of really good examples of how this type of technology works. There was just one with it was Physic, the company we mentioned, and the Veterans Affairs Administration to test the sort of accuracy of remote monitoring in heart patients, people who had, I believe, a procedure done, and what it took to keep them from coming back to the hospital. So that, and many others like it, I think will beget many more of these. So I would say 3 to 5 years to have it ubiquitous, but it will become far more prevalent in the next 18 to 24 months.
Great. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Rosanna. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And just a reminder, you can download the slides from today's presentation in the attachments and links section of your BrightTalk user panel, and the webinar replay will be available immediately after we hang up. Take care.